This week, as we come to the 20th week of the church year, we hear some selections from the prophet Isaiah, from his 56th chapter. We hear another section from the letter of Paul to the Romans. Remember that last time we spoke about the fact that the section 9, that is chapters 9 through 11, were a special section. So we hear a section from chapter 11 from there, and the Gospel of Matthew continues. Now, the basic plan that we've been following over the weeks is really to examine the gospel tradition according to Matthew. And not everything that we mention here in these talks will be part of the Sunday selection, because as I've mentioned before, there's a tendency to kind of skip, to leave out certain sections, probably because it would be impossible to do all of Matthew's gospel in a single year. And so there was, on the part of the liturgist, a decision to choose certain sections that might be helpful for the Sunday community as it gathered to celebrate the Eucharist. So with that in mind, it's important to notice that that often provides the basis for a homily. But in looking at the tradition of Matthew, there may be some differences. I've mentioned this before. Matthew, which by the way is the longest of the synoptic traditions, often follows in choosing material for presenting to his community material that's found in the gospel tradition of Mark. So there's a very strong connection at times between the Markan tradition and the Matthean tradition. But just as a quick reminder that Matthew's gospel, written as we've mentioned before, sometime in the mid-80s of the Common Time, was intended primarily for a community of believers who we believe essentially grew up in the Hebraic tradition. And so these would be, again, the use of the phrase may vary. Do we call them Christian Jews or we call them Jewish Christians, depending on where you want to put your emphasis. But what is interesting to note is that in the Gospel of Matthew, there continues to be a tension both within Matthew's Gospel itself, so there are certain members within the believing church of that Matthew represented that had some difficulties of maybe on issues, and also the larger question of this community's relationship to the emerging Jewish community. Now, I mentioned this, and I may have gone through this again, but I just want to kind of put it into the fore, that after the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70, which was a traumatic moment in the life of both Judaism and early developing Christianity, that leadership within the Jewish community, which had primarily before this been in the hands of groups like the Sadducees, who were the priests up in Jerusalem, but when the temple had been destroyed and the city of Jerusalem no longer was the center that it had been, the power of the Sadducees was gone, and the need for leadership now shifted. And the leadership fell into the hands of a group known as the rabbis, or more popularly, the Pharisees. Now, I mention all of this because, and I don't think we've talked about this before, the Pharisees, often as they are used by Christian writers and homilists through the centuries, have often come off as the bad guys, as kind of, sticklers for the law and kind of questioning things that Jesus did, always with a negative aspect. And it is true that in the Gospel of Matthew, there is a tension between Matthew's community and the Pharisees of Matthew's time. Now, keep this in mind, that the Pharisees of Matthew's time were not necessarily, and in many cases were not, the Pharisees in Jesus' time. Yes, there were Pharisees in Jesus' time. The development of the Pharisee sect or group took place almost 200 years before Jesus' time, shortly, maybe a little less than that, after the famous Maccabean rebellion, and when the control of Israel had once again returned to the hands of the Israelites. A group of Jews did not like the leadership of Judaism that went on in Jerusalem, and that group eventually became known as the Pharisees, the separatists. They were not priests, they were teachers, they were rabbis. They were well respected by the common person. But one of the points that I'd like to make today is that even within the Pharisee group, there were differences of opinion as to what was important and what should be stressed. Much like even in Catholicism today, there are different groups of Catholics who hold different emphases on different practices and customs. If you don't believe this, well, just look around and just listen. So sometimes when we use the group Pharisees as if we can make this is what all Pharisees believed and did. Not quite the case. Now, I mention all of this because the gospel today, this week, is from chapter 15, but begins at verse 21. Well, would you like to know what went on in the first three verses 1 through 20 of Matthew's 15th chapter? In fact, the 14th chapter, which we looked at last time, had ended. You remember that Jesus had walked on the sea, calmed the waters, had ended with the disciples and Jesus coming off the boat at a place called Gennesaret. And there he was recognized who he was. Word was sent around the district, and Jesus had extended healing and forgiveness to many people. In fact, the phrase is used that many sought only to touch the fringe of his garment. Some little phrase that was used earlier on at a woman who was seeking a healing from Jesus. So chapter 14 ends with Jesus once again returning to the role of being a healer, someone who is bringing help and support to people. Now, as chapter 15 begins, we now meet a group of Pharisees and scribes who come to where Jesus is. Now, by the way, not every Pharisee was a scribe, nor was every scribe a Pharisee. And so although the term is used, scribes and Pharisees, they are most often two different groups. The scribes, as you remember, really did what their name would indicate, a scribe, someone who writes. They were members within Judaism who knew how to read and write, and so that made them very important. For us, it might be a little surprising that not everyone learned or knew how to read and write. They did not, ordinary person, know how to speak Hebrew or Greek, but probably did not know how to write it. But the scribes did, and therefore that gave them a great deal of importance. We even use the phrase sometimes, the power of the pen. Well, that was a power certainly that scribes had, and they could also be important interpreters of the law, which in Judaism was known as the Torah. So now we have a group of Pharisees and scribes who come to Jesus, and they raise with him two issues with regard to how the law, the Torah, should be kept. Now, I meant, going back to a point I made a moment ago, this is a unique group of Pharisees who singled out of the larger law of the people two issues that they found very important, namely a practice of hand washing and a practice which Mark calls, and which we know was called korban. Now, what was hand washing? Hand washing was not technically what you told your kids to do, or that we're told to do now very often, wash our hands to keep them clean because we're going to eat or because we're going to do something. Hand washing was much more a ritual, something that was done before prayer was entered into, something that became kind of got the person who was going to pray or join the group in prayer cleansed, appropriately ready. That custom of washing hands, of course, was picked up, was important, but for this group of Pharisees, it's not to say that the others didn't, but it is to say that they didn't put the same emphasis on hand washing. And so now is the question where Jesus is encountered. This is what happens in verses 1 through 20. Jesus is encountered by some who say to him, "Your disciples don't wash their hands enough." Well, Jesus now makes the case, that's a fine tradition, but it's not, as far as I'm concerned, says Jesus, all that necessary. Now, it doesn't mean that he didn't think it was important, but he didn't see it in the same or with the same emphasis that the Pharisees, and again, these would be the Pharisees of Matthew's community. Now, we're not quite sure what the Pharisees of Jesus' time actually thought were important at times. That is something always to keep in mind, that we're looking at the story of Jesus as remembered by the writer Matthew. So this custom was important to them. And keep in mind that the word in this section also speaks of the tradition. Now, the tradition is something which isn't necessarily written down in the law, but it is a way of interpreting the meaning of the law. In fact, we, in our Catholic tradition, of course, have followed that for many, many centuries, that along with the Scripture, with the Bible, there is a development of tradition, of practices, of customs. Some of these have stayed very firm in our faith for centuries, and others have come and gone. So the idea of tradition we would understand as something which was important to the Pharisees. They saw the tradition as updating the Torah and its meaning. The other group at the time, certainly at Jesus' time, were the Sadducees, who would have nothing to do with that kind of approach. If it was not to be found in the Torah, in the law, it was need not at all to be observed. The second point that is raised in this reading is the practice of korban. Now, what this meant is that a person could take money and donate it or set it aside for the poor. Now, what Jesus is kind of objecting to the Pharisees is, you let that practice go on because it now allows you not to have to take care of your parents who need your help and your support. And you say to them, I don't know if they would have done this, well, I've given it to Korban. I'd like to help you, Mom, but the money is set aside for Korban. Now, Jesus says, come on, that's a little bit of a double play. And he says, my tradition, our tradition, is always to remember the poor and the needy. So in this section, there is a kind of sharp criticism between the Pharisees' practice, that is, these two practices that we've just mentioned, that was going on in the community that Matthew's group were familiar with. And again, a caution does not mean that all Pharisees all throughout the Mediterranean world were doing the same thing or had the same tradition. But it's important also to notice that this is not a battle here between Christianity and Judaism, as if Jesus is teaching something that only Christians should do. No. It was a tension within the community of Matthew. So that's the background that leads to now the scripture passages for this week, which finds Jesus moving toward the territory of Tyre and Sidon. Now, on a map, you would notice that Tyre and Sidon were two areas or sections, there were a little more than cities, which lie on the coast of the Mediterranean, just north of the territory of the Galilee. But it was considered to be Gentile territory or non-Jewish territory. Now, in the gospel tradition of Mark, and this is what I was mentioning before, this section is recorded also in Mark, but Matthew puts a couple of little changes in it. The first is that in Mark's gospel, it appears that Jesus is in the territory of Tyre and Sidon and is encountered by a woman who he identifies as a Syro-Phoenician woman, who makes a request to Jesus that he might help her daughter who is ill or bothered by a demon. Now, Matthew changes this a little bit by saying that Jesus is approached by a Canaanite woman. Now, certainly a Canaanite woman could be Syro-Phoenician, but because of the background of Judaism that is very much used in Matthew's gospel, Canaan, of course, if you remember, happened to be the land into which years and years ago Joshua had led the Israelites when they had crossed the Jordan and come into the land of Canaan. So the whole of Israel, its earlier name, before it was known as Palestine, was Canaan. And so what happened to the Canaanites is a rather involved and interesting discussion. Did the Canaanites, some of them, ultimately convert to the way of the one God of Israel, or did they move somewhere else? Well, but the fact that he mentions she is a Canaanite indicates that she's an outsider. Now, this raises a little interesting question, because you remember at one point earlier on, Jesus had sent out his disciples and told them to go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Where was the universalism of Jesus' message? Are only Jews supposed to be receiving the message? And again, that indicates a tension within the not only larger community of Judaism, but also the community of Matthew himself. So the woman, now the argument is, and you have to read this very carefully if you do, does Jesus actually go into the territory of Tyre or Sidon, or is he heading toward it, and the woman comes from that place to greet Jesus or to ask Jesus of help? That would be consistent with the Matthean tradition. And she asks that Jesus would help her because her daughter is being afflicted by demons. Well, Jesus buffs her off. He doesn't respond to her, which now, if you listen, is one of the few times in all of Scripture that Jesus doesn't help someone immediately when they ask for it. In fact, the disciples say to Jesus, "Send her away, she's bothering us." She continues to ask Jesus for assistance. In fact, runs down and calls him Lord, Son of David, using titles that are very important in understanding the messiahship of Jesus. So is she already making an act of faith that Jesus has the ability, if he so chooses, to help her? He, again, seems not to be willing to help her, and then says, you don't give the food of the children to the dogs. Now, that was a very insulting remark. If we might say today things are going to the dogs, but it really was not a very complimentary kind of thing. Well, again, and this is the third time now that she makes a petition to Jesus, says, but Jesus, even the crumbs that fall from the table go to the children. And Jesus now is impressed with her great faith. Now, dogs. I know many of you have pet dogs, and so you might appreciate a little bit what she is saying. But keep in mind also that in the first century world, and this was very true because we have evidence of this coming from some of the earlier works in the Bible, that there were packs of wild dogs that roamed the region, and they were very dangerous. And in fact, when you knew they were coming or in the area, you kept your children inside and away because they could harm and hurt them. So those are the kind of dogs that are mentioned in this kind of, you don't give it to the dogs. But she, and here is kind of the cleverness of this lady, of this woman, turns it around to make the term dog a pet. And you all know, some of you, I'm sure you never did this, but when mom or dad, well, probably with mother, served something that you didn't really like, and she said you will eat it because that's what you're going to have today, and you had a pet dog, would kind of conveniently drop it a little bit, and you wouldn't have any leftover because the dog ate it. So she turns the idea of dog from a wild dog to a pet. And Jesus is very, certainly as we see, impressed by this. Now, some commentators point out that this is one of the few times that Jesus is pictured as changing his mind. And maybe that is interesting. We always assume that Jesus has everything under control, knows everything, and never has to do anything different than whatever the plan was he had. But here's an instance where that might well be the case, that Jesus is pictured as being pretty assured that his mission is essentially to his own people, to the Hebrew community. And now this woman, who shows remarkable faith in accepting Jesus, changes his mind. It's interesting. It's certainly interesting in the sense that it helps us appreciate the humanity of Jesus. That I think, well, I'm sure some of you at least have all had to change your mind, maybe not because some woman convinced you, but because it simply was an idea or an understanding that helped you as you grow up. So the woman here now emerges as a wonderful example of what we would call a praying faith. And remember that all along, up to this point, that had not always been so strong. Going back, remember last week to when Peter steps out into the water and he doubts. And Jesus says, well, where's your faith? Well, now here is an example of a woman who shows remarkable faith in Jesus' ability and in his willingness to help. So those would be a couple of wonderful points to keep in mind. And one of the values, we talked about this earlier, that was very important in the first century world was the value of honor, and the contrariness to honor was shame. So backing up a moment, Gentiles were supposed to stay clear of Jews, and Jews were supposed to stay clear of Gentiles. But here, now the line is brokered and broken. And so that is also an important aspect of this story. Jesus now sets the example that yes, the message of God that he is sent to bring is for the Hebrews, but it is also to include others. And so here is this wonderful woman and her daughter who is afflicted by a demon. Now, just a word about demons. The whole idea of demon is often connected with us with that picture of Satan, dressed in his garment, his fiery sword and all of that. There are code words in the Bible for different things. There is the word Satan, devil, and demon. Now, demon, which is often equated with the other two, but maybe shouldn't be, really is a code word for someone who is ill. They often did not know what caused illnesses any more than we today. We may know what causes the pandemic, but we don't have a cure for it. Well, the demon word indicated someone with some illness, could be any one of the great illnesses that afflicted of the time. And so here again, Jesus' ability to heal comes to the fore. I just want to, in passing, as you know, this particular weekend is on Saturday, the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady into Heaven. It is celebrated, but because of the Saturday, will in many places be blotted out a little bit. But anyway, important because this is a feast in honor of Mary that certainly has come to the fore as a result of a declaration by Pope Pius XII back in 1950, declaring our belief that Mary was taken up into heaven as a dogma of faith. Now, this tradition about Mary, and there were two viewpoints on this, did Mary die and then was taken body and soul into heaven, or did she never really die, but at a certain point in time was taken up into heaven, much as Elijah, you remember, had been taken up in a fiery chariot? That issue has never been solved, so you can have whatever position you want. But there was a position that she died, and then two cities argued that the place of her burial was where it happened. One was the city of Jerusalem, and the other was the city of Ephesus. Well, both of them have a special place in honor of Mary. Both of them claim that this is where she lived after Jesus' time. Both of them claim that she died there, and both of them claim that she was taken up into heaven from there. So take your choice. So you have some options that you could kind of look at today. The different traditions call it the commemoration of Mary, the dormation of Mary. The Eastern Church calls it that, dormation meaning her falling asleep. The passing of Mary, or here in the Western Church we call it the Assumption of Mary. Certainly there are, since this is a scriptural little presentation, there are no scriptural indications of Mary's Assumption. The visitation of Mary to her cousin Elizabeth is the gospel that is used. Visitation, got it, visit to earth, visit to heaven. And you really stretch your imagination a little bit on that. And then the book of Revelation, chapter 12, speaks of a woman clothed with the sun. And we now know that that refers to the church, that is the believing community, but tradition in the Middle Ages attributed to Mary. And those of you, for example, who have miraculous medals will notice that that's the image of Mary that appears on that medal. Well, all of that's a little aside with regard to the Feast of the Assumption of Mary, which is one of the major celebrations in honor of Mary. The others are January 1st, Mary, the Mother of God, the Annunciation, March 15th, and Immaculate Conception, December 8th. So keep our devotion to Mary in mind this coming week. We will, as we move on next week, go back to look again at chapter 9 through 11 in Paul's letter to the Romans, because there's a very important message there, which I hope that we would be able to look at. And if you stretch your imagination quickly, the reading from Isaiah for this week simply talks about the fidelity leading, see, that all people would be led to the Lord on Mount Sinai. So in Israel, that's where everyone would come together. Well, Jesus is now bringing the Samaritan woman, and we hope brings all of us to a closer relationship with the Lord. So thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you next time.